All right, I will call this meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee to order. Will the secretary please take the roll?
Senator Harris, Senator Orenshaw, Senator Dondero Loop, Senator Wynn, Senator Hansen, Senator Krasner, Senator Stone, Chair Scheibel.
Here, thank you so much. We will go ahead and get started with our work session for today. We have 5 bills on work session, I believe, and we will start with Senate Bill 36. I will hand it over to our policy analyst, Mr. Guinan, to walk through the work session document.
Thanks, Chair Scheibel. For the record, Patrick Guinan. As the Chair just mentioned, we have 5 bills on today. Everybody should have the work session before them. It's also online, so I'll just get started. Senate Bill 36 is the first one. That's a Senate Committee on Judiciary bill on behalf of the Attorney General. We heard it here on the 2nd of March. It adds the solicitation of a child for prostitution to the list of sexual offenses which require a psychosexual evaluation and certification that the person convicted of the offense does not represent a high risk to reoffend. If a defendant is convicted of a felony other than a sexual offense or of a gross misdemeanor for which the sentence may be suspended or probation granted, the Division of Parole and Probation is required to arrange for a psychosexual evaluation of the defendant and provide a pre-sentence investigation and report to the court regarding the evaluation if the defendant and the prosecuting attorney jointly request a pre-sentence investigation and report, including a psychosexual evaluation. There is an amendment that was proposed by the Attorney General. It's attached on the following page. It clarifies that the provisions described in the second paragraph above only apply if the original charge was for a sexual offense as defined in statute. That's all I have on that one, Chair Scheibel.
All right, any questions on SB 36? And there was an amendment on that, right?
Correct. It's
Which you just walked through.
yeah. It stipulates, or it provides that the provisions regarding the evaluation and the pre-sentencing report only apply if the original charge is for a sexual offense.
Thank you. Any other questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, I would accept a motion to amend and do pass. All right, we have a motion from Senator Dondero Loop and a second from Senator Wynn. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay? Please note that the motion has passed unanimously. Is there a volunteer for the floor statement? All right, then I'll give it to Senator Wynn. Up next on our work session is SB 55. I'll hand it over again to Mr. Guinan to walk us through this.
Thanks, Chair. Again, for the record, Patrick Guinan. This is another committee bill that was brought on behalf of the Nevada Supreme Court. Senate Bill 55 was heard here on February 23rd. It adds justice and municipal courts to the list of those that are prohibited from being open or transacting business on a Sunday or a holiday. It revises the fees that a justice court is to charge for conducting searches of electronic or physical records and for redacting personal identifying information before disseminating certain records. It also changes the title of deputy clerk to clerk of the court and revises provisions governing the exercise of duties and the liability of the clerk. And finally, the bill revises provisions under which a criminal case can be transferred from one justice court to another and provides that a court must grant a credit of not less than the state minimum wage for a person who performs community service as required by the court. The Judiciary has proposed an amendment which is attached. The amendment strikes Section 1 of the bill regarding hours of operation for justice courts and Section 3 of the bill regarding the fees that I described above. It strikes those 2 sections from the bill entirely, which leaves the current statutory provisions in place in those areas. That's all I have, Chair.
All right, any questions about SB 55? I don't see any questions, so I would accept a motion to amend and do pass. We have a motion from Senator Orenshaw and a second from Senator Wynn. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay? All right, the motion passes unanimously. Do I have a volunteer for the floor statement? Senator Orenshaw. And that brings us to SB 62.
Excuse me. Thanks, Chair. Again, for the record, Patrick Guinan. Senate Bill 62 is another committee bill. This one is again on behalf of the Supreme Court. Senate Bill 62 was heard on February 23rd. It provides that an appointing authority may not appoint a person to serve as a member of the Commission on Judicial Discipline who has already served at least 2 consecutive full terms. These provisions apply to appointments made on or after October 1st of 2023. The Judiciary proposed an amendment to this bill which replaces the original contents of the bill and instead is intended to clarify the disciplinary jurisdictions of the State Bar and the Commission on Judicial Discipline for attorney judges. The new language as proposed provides that, quote, "The commission's jurisdiction with respect to attorney judges begins when the judge is sworn in. The State Bar of Nevada retains jurisdiction over matters that occurred prior to the assumption of office." That's all, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Guinan. Any questions on SB 62? All right, I would accept a motion to amend and do pass. All right, we have a motion from Senator Harris, a second from Senator Nguyen. I forgot to ask in previous work session, for the first two bills, is there any discussion on the motion? I know you all are not shy in speaking up if there is. So all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. Please note that the motion has passed unanimously, and that brings us to SB 67. And the floor assignment goes to Senator Harris for reminding me. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Chair. Patrick Guinan again. We're at SB 67 now. This is another committee bill which was brought on behalf of the Department of Safety and heard here on February 9th. Senate Bill 67 revises the definition of sexual offense in portions of Chapter 213 of NRS relating to parole for persons who are convicted of a sexual offense to make the definition consistent with that found elsewhere in NRS. And there are no amendments.
All right, any questions on SB 67? We have a motion to do pass by Senator Stone. Any second? A second from Senator Nguyen. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. The motion passes unanimously. Is there a volunteer for the floor statement? I will give it to Senator Stone. And that brings us to SB 234.
Thanks, Chair. This is the last bill on the work session. Patrick Guinan again. SB 234 is officially sponsored by the chair and Senator Harris and others. It was heard here on March 24th of 2023. Senate Bill 234 directs the Nevada Department of Corrections, to the extent money is available, to establish and administer a pilot program to provide free communication services between offenders housed in NDOC and their children. The bill allows NDOC to accept gifts, grants, and other forms of donations to carry out the program, and requires the director to provide the legislature with a report on the pilot program prior to the 83rd session of the legislature. There is an amendment, Chair, that was offered by Youth Legislator Max Grinstein, who was here and presented the bill with you when we heard it. The amendment is conceptual and, excuse me, it adds additional funding as needed from the Offender Store Fund to make up any deficiency in funds gathered through grants, donations, et cetera. And it also requires additional information to be reported by the director regarding how many children utilized the program, which grants were applied for and received by NDOC, and on any available statistical information regarding differences in conduct and disciplinary issues between offenders whose children utilized the pilot program and those whose children did not. And finally, the amendment adds a clarifying phrase, quote unquote, two-way voice and or video communication to subsection 6 of the bill. And that's all I have, Chair.
All right, and I see Youth Legislator Greenstein is here if we have any questions for him. Are there any questions on SB 234? All right, then. I would accept a motion to amend and do pass. All right, we have a motion from Senator Orenshaw and a second from Senator Nguyen. All in favor say aye. Aye. And any opposed, nay. All right, the motion passes unanimously. I wish I could assign the floor statement to Youth Legislator Greenstein, but you will have to entrust me with it instead. But maybe you can write my remarks for me. And with that, we are at the conclusion of our work session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. That brings us to our bill hearing for today. On SB 294, I will invite Senator Doñate and Ms. Bivens to the table to begin their presentation whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Chair Scheibel, and good afternoon to the members of Senate Judiciary. For the record, my name is Fabian Doñate, and I am proud to represent Senate District 10 in the heart of Las Vegas. It's exciting. It's an exciting moment for me. It's my first time in front of this committee, and so please take it easy on me. But, you know, I think for the purposes of today, we're going to be talking about a very important subject, and I hope that in this presentation, we can just have a conversation as to a public health issue that many folks in my district and in my work of life interact with, and I hope that we can carry at least some conversation as to why this is relevant today. I come before you to speak on Senate Bill 294, which revises provisions relating to safe storage requirements and school safety. For this hearing, I am honored to be joined by Ms. Samantha Bivens. There are countless examples of what we'll talk about today. Robb Elementary School, Sandy Hook Elementary, Virginia Tech, University of Texas Austin, Stoneman Douglas, and just a few short days ago, the Covenant School in Nashville, Tennessee. Over and over again, we have encountered the issue of gun violence in our schools, and never have our efforts been enough to solve this issue. We go back and forth whether as to providing more mental health services or if there are common sense reforms, but it's nearly not enough to stop or at least prevent the outcomes that we're seeing in society. Gun violence in this country is a public health crisis, in my opinion. And through Senate Bill 294, we hope to make some sort of progress to address this issue that needs some level of common sense reforms. Today, I'm going to spend some time reviewing the language of SB 294, the background on safe storage laws, the implications on public health, and then we'll have some remarks from Ms. Bivens and other folks to share why this is a prevalent issue in our society. SB 294 is an act that relates to firearms. In this bill, we seek to address a few things. Number one, requiring a licensed dealer to provide a locking device capable of securing a firearm with each sale or transfer of a firearm. Number two, requiring licensed gun dealers to post a notice on their premises which informs the buyer that the unlawful storage of a firearm may result in imprisonment or fine. Number three, requiring the board of each school district or governing body to adopt regulations regarding trauma-informed and age-appropriate resources for both students and faculty. And then number four, requiring DHHS to develop and implement a safe firearm storage education campaign. These are the provisions that we seek to address with SB 294, and we'll touch point in this hearing as to why these are relevant. As you all know, the Nevada Safe Storage Act was introduced through AB 153 back in 2019, and it was added into AB 291, which was enacted by law by Governor Sisolak. Currently, Nevada makes it a misdemeanor offense to negligently store or leave a firearm at a location under a person's control if the person knows or has reason to know that there's a substantial risk to a child. That has already been established via law, and we'll talk about that as how it reflects in the amendment. I want to provide a quick clarification that in our state statutes as they currently stand today, Nevada does not have a law that requires the unattended firearms to be stored in a certain way, nor do we require a locking device to accompany the sale of a firearm or require firearm owners to affirmatively lock their weapons. Let's be clear with one thing. My goal today is to establish the connection between gun violence and public health. I recognize there are other bills this session that may seek to address this issue in other capacities, but there's an underlying truth. Over and over again, we have seen statistics that have shown the impact of gun violence on children and adolescents. Firearm injuries and deaths in the United States have substantially increased, becoming the leading cause of death amongst children 19 and below. It's important to share with the committee the statistics that have been gathered on gun violence and to paint the narrative on what's happening in the reality with these encounters. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, today in the United States, firearms are the leading cause of death among children. Gun violence can have negative ramifications to the mental health and well-being of our children, and I will touch point on this research in another slide. Further, we have some research collected within the last few years that throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen an increase in firearm-related deaths among children, bringing the seriousness of this issue even more relevant. Based on this initial research, we know that assaults have accounted for at least half of all youth firearm deaths, while suicides by firearms have accounted for at least 3 in 10 of those deaths. That's a sobering number that deserves our pause and reflection. When we talk about children that are exposed to gun violence and the adverse effects of firearms, there are some encounters that can lead to negative health outcomes. Based on research that has been released in recent years, as outlined by the Kaiser Family Foundation, the cases that we see with regard to negative health outcomes and gun violence are in households that either experience domestic violence, have a firearm stored at home, or children that are exposed to neighborhood and school violence. Further, we know that children that have been exposed to gun violence are predisposed to certain conditions or after effects based on their encounters with this issue. For instance, research has shown that survivors exposed to gun violence may be at an increased risk of PTSD, anxiety, other mental health conditions, and substance use disorders. In this chart, we see the data reflects, so essentially this is the provisional data of firearm-related deaths per 100,000 children and adolescents in the U.S., and this is between 2011 and 2021. So as you can see, this issue has been exacerbated in recent years, bless you, which is why policy actions should consider common sense reforms to address this rising public health issue. This data in this chart specifically indicates the cause of data attributable to firearm mortality has increased over the years, and this data was gathered from the CDC Wonder database. When we look at the number of deaths due to suicide among children and adolescents from the same time period, by firearm or by other means, we can see in this chart that there is an exponential increase in these encounters. Again, this data was analyzed by the Kaiser Family Foundation and was pulled from the CDC Wonder database. We discussed this earlier in this presentation, but here's more research to establish this narrative. We know that students that have been exposed to gun violence is a prevalent issue. In a study that was released by the U.S. Department of Education in 2018, communities with exposures to firearm shootings found that the majority of teenagers and parents felt at least somewhat concerned or worried that a school shooting may one day happen at their school. This is a common theme. It has been established by the U.S. Department of Education. And I also want to note that when we fail to address these stressors or adequately prepare for these encounters, gun violence exposures in our schools can lead to absenteeism, grade repetition, reduced high school graduations, reduced college enrollments, etc. I think there's an economic consequence when we don't prepare the right resources for how our students deal with this issue. The fact of the matter is gun violence is occurring. We can talk about, which I'm sure we'll have other hearings as to how this issue plays out and where policy can come into, but the reality is we're encountering it, whether we acknowledge it or not. For those who are wondering about other state legislation, as of 2021, 11 states have passed laws involving firearm locking devices at the point of sale. Massachusetts and Oregon have enacted legislation on firearms stored with a lock in place. California, Colorado, Connecticut, and New York have passed laws with gun locking requirements in certain situations. And then there's other states that have provisions with locking devices and certain standards they must meet. Why is this conversation relevant? I know that's a question that I have received for this bill, and it's important to share with you what's happening on the ground. Between August 2022 and February 2023, this is the preliminary data that was shared by Clark County School District. Within this past school year, there have been 29 encounters with a BB and air gun, and at least 26 encounters with a handgun. Most of these encounters are occurring in high school, but there are a few instances occurring in our elementary and middle schools. It's pretty frightening. It's frightening to believe that a child, possibly less than 11 years old, would bring a gun to school in our own backyards. And I think there's an opportunity to potentially find a way to solve this. Lastly, I spent a portion of this presentation detailing for you the national trends, but it's important to share how the gun violence impacts our state. Between 2014 and 2018, firearms were listed as the leading cause of death among children in this state. In Nevada, an average of 36 children and teens die by gun violence every year, and 53% of these deaths are homicides. The thing that we always say in public health is every death is preventable, and that's the perspective that we should look at when we look at this legislation. Here's the hard part of SB 294. I can sit here and share with you statistics and numbers and how this prevalence of this injury has increased, but none of it really matters because if we don't do anything about it or find some strategies to come together, then the issue is going to keep on going. And just the last week, while we were in Senate Education, we had an encounter at one of our schools. On March 29th, CCSD police and Metro responded to Shadow Ridge High School after reports came out of a student with a gun on campus. We know that this is a common occurrence, and that's why my earlier slide showed you in terms of the data points being gathered by CCSD. When we look at the social media response, I want to spend some time for you reading the tweets from a journalist in Southern Nevada. End quote. This was the scene as students rushed out of Shadow Ridge High School, many running up and hugging their parents. Some had tears in their eyes. Several parents shared frustrations with me about the communication from CCSD. Some say they didn't get an email update at all. Others were frustrated that there wasn't more communication during the lockdown. It's clear to me that obviously there are some few improvements that can be made, and it's our job to ensure that parents, guardians, and community members are made aware of an emergency and how to appropriately respond to this issue. It's shameful for me to go on Twitter midday and to see students hiding underneath their desks while SWAT teams patrol our high schools, but that's the encounter that we find ourselves in. And that's what Senate Bill 294 aims to solve, and it's part of the reason why we're here today proposing this bill. To conclude, I don't want to spend more time on the bill presentation itself since the bill is pretty self-explanatory, but I think it's important for you all to understand the conceptual amendment that I sent to you all yesterday. In the conceptual amendment, we aim to do the following. So we plan to strike Section 3 of the bill and reinstitute the original NRS language that was adopted in 2019, which is now reflected in Section 6. That was one of the main concerns that we received from folks. And so rather than relitigating that fight, let's continue on and establish that we don't want to go back to how that conversation played out. Further, in Section 8 and Section 9 of the bill, we will be removing the language on active shooter preparedness, and rather instead, we will require the Board of Trustees of each school district to take certain action. In our conceptual amendment, if a school district has police officers under their jurisdiction, those officers will now be required to either receive training to perform active or silent movement techniques or to collaborate with other law enforcement jurisdictions to participate in joint exercises to perform active or silent movement techniques. Again, this is if they have folks that would qualify. My understanding is the majority of these individuals are in Washoe and Clark County, but if they ever come to that capacity, then it would be that either they create their own program or they coordinate with other law enforcement to prepare. It's the same way that we prepare for other emergencies. Further, we will be adding a new subsection to the bill, which will require school districts with 50,000 or more pupils to develop a plan that will facilitate the coordination of active or silent trainings with other law enforcement agencies and public safety organizations, school administrators, and appropriate staff personnel. This is codifying what CCSD already does. We want to make sure that administrators, appropriate staff personnel, so each school should identify who are the appropriate staff personnel to respond in these situations, and coordinating with law enforcement so that if this encounter occurs, everyone knows how it will play out. I think that's important because what you don't want is a situation where one school is responding one way and another school is responding another way, because as we've seen in other encounters in this country, when we fail to coordinate with one another or prepare for these circumstances, that is where the consequences arise with our response. And so for us, we want to make sure that the plan should use, the plans that these school districts will cover should use trauma-informed and age-appropriate recommendations to develop strategies on supporting students and faculty exposed to community violence. You know, I've been asked a question, is this a way for peace officers to come back to schools and educate students as to why they should take this more seriously, perhaps where parents aren't able to have those conversations, or if they don't have firearms at their home, is this a way that we can continue education? I think that's an appropriate response that could be looked at from the school district. And lastly, these larger school districts will need to review their communication structures to parents and guardians during times of an emergency, and ensuring that our families are notified on safe storage requirements outlined per NRS. That has been the frustration that many families have reiterated, where they don't receive the notification of said incident until after, or perhaps it's being sent to the application, but not everyone has the application. I know when I was in my university, whenever we encountered a lockdown or if there was a situation on the part of campus, obviously the campuses were bigger, but we received a notification via text, email, and if you had the application, you would receive it as well. I think this is an opportunity to explore to make sure that parents are engaged and that they know the situations that their kids could be encountered. And I think it's what we owe our constituents, just to have that conversation if it hasn't already occurred. We believe that these are common sense reforms that can reduce the prevalence of firearms being brought to schools onto campus, and we hope that in some ways this can reduce the trauma being experienced by our faculty and students. So, Chair Scheibel, at this time, I want to turn it over to Ms. Bivens, who can share her experiences and why this bill came forward to begin with.
For the record, Samantha Bivens. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to speak with you regarding this important legislation today. My name is Samantha Bivens, and I am a Gold Star wife of a combat Marine, a Blue Star mom of an Army infantryman, and I currently serve as the executive officer of the 31st Combat Training Squadron Virtual Test and Training Center at Nellis Air Force Base. I first became passionate about student safety in 2015 when I was serving as a senator in CSUN student government at UNLV with Senator Donate. During my tenure, I was a sponsoring senator of a proposal to upgrade the emergency phone system on campus and the funding, filming, and implementation of the Run, Hide, Fight active shooter training video, which is still used on campus today. In 2022, in anticipation of the upcoming legislative session, Senator Donate and I began talking about collaborating on legislation in relation to active shooter training in K-12 settings, as well as the safe storage of firearms. SB 294 is the result of that collaboration. I believe that training our children on the most effective ways to react in an active shooter situation is critical to survival. As a mother of 4 and a grandmother, I understand that this training is not a one-size-fits-all task. We must be mindful and tailor the message being delivered specifically to the grade and age level of the students who are receiving it. Coming from a psychology background, I don't believe that children receiving this information is traumatizing. I'm certain that most people in this room today have received emergency response training, such as fire drills and actions to take during an earthquake, hurricane, or tornado. This training provides the necessary tools needed to respond in a firearm-related incident. Additionally, this training should be a collaborative effort between school police and local law enforcement. Police officers possess extensive skills in training which can directly benefit school police and bolster their ability to neutralize a volatile situation. As the owner of firearms myself and an individual living in a home with several school-aged children, I take my responsibility to safely storing these weapons very seriously. To me, safe storage is not simply placing a firearm in a drawer. Rather, it entails locking it up and placing it in a small portable case or a gun safe. Senator Donate provided you with the statistics for school incidents involving firearms. This information is alarming. I don't believe that curtailing the ownership of firearms is the solution, but we cannot stand by as more people die. Providing active shooter training to students and faculty can save lives. Mandating firearm locking devices at the time of purchase can save lives. And imposing consequences for the failure to safely store firearms can save lives. Suicide prevention training is yet another topic addressed in SB 294. As someone who has worked extensively with the veteran community for several years, I have experienced the benefits of this training firsthand. Since completing Safe Talk suicide prevention training, I have been able to identify individuals suffering from a mental health crisis before the situation escalated. We need to teach school faculty the signs to look for which indicate a crisis, as well as providing services for those affected by a suicide. The key to curbing suicide lies in prevention, not reaction. Having successfully drafted, presented, and had legislation passed before this body in the past, I learned that although having a bill come to fruition can be difficult and contentious, the process can have a positive outcome. I'm certain that we can all agree that we want to see all children protected and kept out of harm's way. We can diligently and persistently work toward that goal if we support common sense legislation that is responsible, comprehensive, and is written to satisfy lawmakers and industry stakeholders who sit on both sides of the aisle. I'm asking you all to please look at this bill with thoughtful consideration and work together to ensure that gun violence doesn't continue to rob our children of their lives and others of their peace of mind, security, and innocence. In closing, I'd like to share a few quotes. These words represent the thoughts of two men, one a Republican former senator and the other a Democratic former president. The goal with a big piece of social legislation is to have a bipartisan result so that the country will accept it. Senator Lamar Alexander. A good compromise, a good piece of legislation is like a good sentence or a good piece of music. Everybody can recognize it. They say, it works. It makes sense. President Barack Obama. It is time to come together and change the narrative. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Fabian Donate. For the record, Chair Scheibel, that concludes our presentation. We're happy to take any questions from the committee members.
All right, questions from members of the committee. Senator Orenshaw.
Senator Donate and Ms. Bivens, thank you for presenting the bill. You talked about some of the adverse, toxic childhood experiences that so many children have had now with firearms, whether it's a lockdown. And I just wonder, with your background in public health, do you think those adverse experiences, those traumatic incidents, is that going to lead to a lifetime of dealing with those issues for those kids? Is that something that that, if something like your bill doesn't pass and this keeps happening, we're going to have kids that are just dealing with this trauma of things they've suffered throughout their lives. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Senator Fabian Doñate, for the record. So, correct. In one of the most recent studies that came out, I'm going to see if I can go back to it. Trauma at schools, impacts on shootings on students' human capital. So, this is the most recent study that came out in 2022, and what it establishes is there are economic consequences that could lead to, for instance, a child experiencing a level of gun violence, just in general, right? Whether it's at school or in their communities at home. In the study, it showed that the students that they followed after they graduated, that when they were impacted, if they were involved, say, in a classroom, or there was some capacity involving a level of shooting at their schools, that not only were there consequences while they were enrolled in school, which I mentioned as absenteeism, reductions in graduation, etc., but as they would move on after high school, when they would go to college, there were the same encounters. They would suffer from anxiety, PTSD from the encounters that they had in high school, and the economic consequence, which is probably the most prevalent to this bill, is it led to some level of medium income that perhaps wasn't a disparity because of the consequences that they had from the emotional outcomes that they received. So there are consequences to the human capital when these encounters occur.
Well, I appreciate you bringing the bill, Senator Doñate, and thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Other questions from the committee?
What are you looking at me for, Chair? Sure, I've got lots of questions, of course.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Couple of points. First of all, the leading cause of death, it is true that there's been a rise in 2021, 22, but also what's not being mentioned is there's been a dramatic drop-off in the traditional highest category of motor vehicle collisions. You'll see a big drop there, and you'll see a slight uptick with the homicide rate among children. So I think we better recognize while there has been an increase, there's also been a decrease in the more traditional one. The other point along those lines, if you look at the spike window that you have up there, it corresponds almost perfectly with the exact same window of time when we had a huge effort in our country to defund the police. So as you had a decline in law enforcement efforts, you saw an increase in the number of homicides involving children. And I dug into this research pretty thoroughly. And what you see is that the homicide spike is in gang-related killings, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19-year-olds, and it's disproportionately among black inner-city kids who are involved in gang shootings. So I think that needs to be recognized too. When you actually average it out and take those factors out, you see there's not really that big of a deal. It is interesting that among suicides there's been a spike, but that's disproportionately white kids actually committing suicide. Gun violence, too, all the cases you mentioned, those are all gun-free zones. You know, the decline in gun violence in the United States, as far as criminal activity, has gone down where you have CCW programs, including here in Nevada. And also, we just had a hearing where we attacked the school police for being too aggressive. Man, I don't know how those poor guys can operate, because on one hand we're telling them back off because you're throwing kids on the ground and bouncing their heads off the sidewalk. But on the other hand, we're basically telling them that you're not doing enough because we got, 36 or handguns in the schools or whatever. So I guess the question to all this is, as I look at the whole scenario, while it is okay to call it a public health crisis, I think there's also so many other factors such as gang activity, single-parent household problems where these kids don't have fathers in the homes. I think that's been a huge spike in that stuff too. So when you do these analyses, have you factored some of those things in as well? As far as it's not just public health in the sense, it's like COVID sickness going around.
Thank you so much, Senator Fabian Doñate, for the record. I'm going to try my best to touch point on all the points. So there are sentiments that you've shared that has been reiterated in the public health data that I've reviewed, specifically in the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is because of, I mean, we're going to talk about it in this session with other bills as well. The prevalence of mental health outcomes and how the lockdown resulted in children for whatever reason, right, and how that actually played out to be. Because children were at home more, we could argue that that was the escalation. But I mean, the reality is it exists. You are correct in the Kaiser Family Foundation report. It did share that minority populations, minority children did experience higher outcomes. That is a data point that was relevant in terms of firearm deaths. You know, I don't see this bill as a criticism of CCSD police because I use their practices to codify it. I think they're actually doing something really well. What this comes down to, what I realized, and you know, what Ms. Bivens and I were discussing, is I think there's an education and a component of accountability that has to also come down to parents. And if we pass these laws, we have a due diligence to make sure that parents are understanding of the laws that we pass. Obviously, the child bringing a gun to school resulted in either a failure of firearm storage for whatever reason, or parents were not being held to an account. What that looks like in the future, I think that's up for debate. But the full reality is we have an obligation, especially if this is a prevalent issue, to communicate to parents, this is the law. We can disagree on the law, but we are having encounters of students bringing guns to schools, so let's make sure that we're all on the same page. Again, it's making sure that it's codified, that we're continuing the collaboration so that we don't have systems or situations where one entity or one law enforcement agency is stepping over the other. If this situation happens, we should know how to respond to it. If there's a shooting that happens across the school, but not on school premises, we should know how to respond to it. And we should know the role of everyone, regardless of what school that is. And that's pretty much my personal response to it. I think, you know, I specifically, like I mentioned, I specifically used CCSD's policies to write this bill because I think some of the practices could be enacted statewide. And if you have officers in your jurisdiction, especially in the rules, if you don't have the capacity to do these training programs, then collaborate with other folks. There's nothing wrong with making sure that people are trained and prepared. I think that's the important aspect. And I think, unless if you have other follow-up questions.
I've got a few, but the chair always gives me a little flexibility. I don't want to abuse that. Just so you know, we're on the same page, okay? Nobody here wants to see school shootings. Nobody wants to, have anything. My alma mater, my middle school, Sparks Middle School, had a terrible shooting about 7 or 8 years ago now. You know, that's school I went to. So I'm aware of the problem. I'm just thinking, okay, as we try to develop the solutions, there's some other issues that sometimes come into play. The bill you mentioned from 2019, I remember very well. It was Ozzie Fumo's bill, and we ended up amending it significantly on the storage portion because what was recognized is when you see people who own firearms, 2/3 of them who buy them say it's for self-defense purposes, and what you saw was this huge spike in black females in particular buying firearms for self-defense purposes, and then they would store them loaded close to their bed, nightstand, or whatever, and they would have been the ones that would have been disproportionately charged under the new statute. And Ozzie recognized that, and we did too. It's like, well, that isn't fair because they live in neighborhoods which are frankly scary, and while the police respond when they can, the time is often well beyond the ability to actually, you know, prevent a crime. And so these black women in particular were buying handguns for self-defense. And then they couldn't store them like we'd like to see simply because they needed them to be available to literally deter violence against themselves. And we obviously don't want to have them being punished for that. And that was why the storage portion of that 2019 bill, as I recall, was amended out. So, you know, there's some interesting dynamics in there because what we don't want to see is disproportionate numbers of women and minorities being punished for basically being in areas where, frankly, the police presence can't be fast enough or enough to really make them feel safe in their homes. Honestly, I live in a neighborhood where I don't even lock my doors at night. You know, I don't. There's no danger in my neighborhood. My house has got firearms, lots of them. But I don't have that sense of need like somebody in an inner city area, especially where crime is extremely high or gang activity is going on. So anyway, I just want you to know, look, we're on the same page as far as trying to solve the problem. I just don't know sometimes if when we're trying to get there, we got to be careful we don't, in some cases, penalize people that have very legitimate self-defense needs when it comes to firearm usage. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Other questions from committee members? There are a few things I want to clarify, and I'll start by following up on Senator Hansen's questions about the safe storage. I just want to clarify again that the amendment would retain the language that was passed in 2019 regarding safe storage. It doesn't change that at all.
Thank you, Chair. Fabian Dugnato, for the record, that's correct.
But it does impose an additional requirement, if you will, that gun stores provide some kind of information to people as they're purchasing firearms about the existence of the safe storage law. Is that accurate?
Thank you, Chair. Fabian Dugnato, for the record, that's correct.
So to me, that seems to comport with our general kind of philosophy that you can't punish people for something if they don't know that they're supposed to be or not supposed to be doing it. And so this bill kind of I don't want to say that it is a companion piece to the safe storage provisions that we previously passed. And so this bill kind of follows up and says, and in addition, anybody who'd be subject to those laws has to be informed about them. Is that kind of the idea in the second section?
Thank you, Chair. Fabian Dugnato, for the record. Ideally, yes. I think it's important for parents to understand the provisions that were passed in law in 2019 because we're still seeing these encounters, and so we can do a little bit better as a community to inform parents. So that's correct.
And then the second provision of the bill, now that we're keeping the safe storage laws, we've added an informational factor for parent or for gun purchasers. And then the second thing that the bill does is provide for training for law enforcement. And is it just in school settings or is it elsewhere?
Thank you so much, Chair. Fabian Dugnato, for the record. So the two subsections, so the first one is for all school districts. So if they have officers that operate under their jurisdiction, some of them don't in the rules, that if they don't already, they would either have to do an active assailant technique training so that they're understanding of what this entails. Of course, most of the time, this is already as part of their regulatory training, but if they don't already have it, that they would be required to, or collaborate with other law enforcement so that they can prepare for that situation. And then it takes it a step further for the bigger counties, which is then we start to look at, okay, how does this collaboration not just work with law enforcement, but other public safety organizations, school administration, and appropriate staff. So it looks at it in two different parts.
And could you speak a little bit to what kinds of conversations you've had with those agencies, whether they are ready and able to implement these policies? You mentioned that some of them are already doing this. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that? Sure.
So in general, yes. It's the policy that Fabian Dugnato, for the record, the policy that Ms. Bivens and I have written was using the guidelines that CCSD police already work through. So they already have active assailant technique trainings as part of their program, and they coordinate with law enforcement. This just takes a little bit step further, which is making sure that administrators and appropriate staff are aware for their particular school. It's codifying it in law so that we can continue to make revisions in the long term, and it's just going to be part of the standard practices that we have as part of our emergency preparedness.
So do you think that this will help with consistency across time as administrators change, as school boards change, as police chiefs change, that we'll have more consistency in the implementation of emergency preparedness and active shooter preparedness on campuses throughout Nevada?
Thank you, Chair. Fabian Dugnato, for the record, absolutely. And I think the most important thing is we can also start now looking as how we can connect with the community even more based on the concerns that they have shared, both publicly on social media and in general when these encounters occur, and also looking at how we treat our faculty, staff, and our students when these encounters occur. So I think my goal is to continue it and continue to revise it based on the community needs.
All right, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions from members of the committee, so thank you so much for your presentation. We will move now to testimony in support of SB 294, starting with anybody in person in Carson City or Las Vegas. Go ahead and make your way to the table, and you can start whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Annette Magnus, and I'm the Executive Director of Battleborn Progress. I am here today to show our support for SB 294. I want to thank Senator Doñate for bringing this bill forward as a gun owner. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death for children in the United States. That's astonishing and frankly unacceptable. Children should not go to school afraid that they will be the next target of a mass shooter. Educators should not have to be ready to be in a combat zone to teach and educate our kids. Something has to change, and it starts with prioritizing common sense gun violence policies. We want to give Senator Doñate credit for approaching gun violence from a public health lens and for prioritizing the safety of our communities. SB 294 seeks to make our schools safer and protect young people, educators, and support staff. After we have seen numerous school shootings and the presence of guns in our schools, specifically in Clark County, over the last year, it is our position that we must look at every possible solution to stopping this violence. With the proposed amendment to this bill, we are confident that the intent of the legislation will be to protect our kids and schools. We urge this committee to move this bill forward and to continue taking gun violence prevention seriously. Please support SB 294. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for having me. For the record, my name is Keenan Korth, and I represent the Clark County Education Association, the exclusive bargaining unit for the 18,000 licensed employees in the Clark County School District. CCEA supports Senate Bill 294, and we appreciate Senator Doñate for bringing this important piece of legislation forward. The Safe Storage Act is a necessary intervention to meet this moment. The fact that gun safety has become a major concern for educators, whose primary responsibility should be simply educating our children, is alarming. In a survey of 6,000 CCSD educators, 20% indicated the fact that they do not feel safe in their workplace is a top priority. With a significant increase in the number of firearms recovered on CCSD campuses this year compared to even last year, this feeling of unsafety is more than warranted. Simply put, this status quo amounts to a mass shooting in the making. Safe storage of firearms is critical to preventing the unspeakable from happening in our schools. 3/4 of school shooters acquired their firearms from the home of a parent or a close relative, and an estimated 54% of gun owners do not safely store their guns, even though research has shown that households who lock both their firearms and ammunition were associated with a 78% lower risk of self-inflicted firearm injuries in general, and an 85% lower risk of unintentional firearm injuries among children and teens specifically, compared to those who safely store neither. With school shootings dominating the headlines, lawmakers must act now, before it's too late. Thank you for your time, and CCEA urges your support for SB 294.
Thank you, Chair Scheibel, members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. My name is John Jones, and I'm here on behalf of the Clark County District Attorney's Office in support of SB 294. I want to start off by thanking Senator Doñate for meeting with me on several occasions regarding this bill. You know, tragically, in the last few years, we've had 10 children who have died in Clark County in situations that we can directly trace back to improperly stored firearms. We've had many other children who have been injured due to improperly stored firearms. Failing to properly store a firearm can lead and does lead to fatal and life-altering consequences for our children. And the firearms obtained by these children have been located in unlocked nightstands, literally stored in shoes, vehicle glove boxes, and otherwise left out in the open. And children end up dead when firearms are not stored properly. Yet time after time and case after case, we see firearms left readily accessible to children. And how many times have we heard in this committee particularly that children's brains are not fully developed until they're in their 20s, that they're impulsive and not the best decision makers? We've even seen cases where children who have been supervised around firearms their entire lives, who have been taught firearm safety, make poor decisions when they are given the opportunity to access a firearm unsupervised or in a distressed emotional situation. Tragically, a majority of those 10 cases that I talked about were children who died, were children suffering from mental health conditions or suicidal ideations. A stored firearm could have prevented those deaths. We also have cases where luckily no one was injured. In fact, in one case, we've seen a parent who put a firearm in their child's backpack, forgot about having placed the firearm there, and then sent the child to school with that very backpack. Again, luckily, no one was injured. But we cannot rely on luck where our children are concerned. Providing locking devices, and as Chair Scheibel said, providing notice of safe storage will help. Specifically, Section 10 of this bill will help ensure Nevada parents are educated about unsafe firearm storage. It authorizes the expenditure of money for an educational campaign. It is great policy, and we hope that an appropriation can be made in support of that campaign. With that, Chair, again, we are in support of SB 294. I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Would you be willing to answer a question? And does it matter if it's from Senator Hansen?
Of course,
Surprise,
Chair.
surprise. Hi, John. Thank you, Madam Chair. You mentioned 10 deaths. Now, in the senator's testimony, he'd mentioned 36 deaths, 56% of which were homicides. Of your 10 deaths, you included suicides, and all deaths, right? Accidents, suicides, homicides?
John Jones on behalf of the Clark County District Attorney's Office. What I'm talking about are situations that generally occurred in the home where we can directly tie it back to an unsafe storage situation. So we're not talking about incidents that occurred outside the home.
Okay, well then, if you include all of them, were there 36 deaths of youth in Clark County?
John Jones on behalf of the Clark County District Attorney's Office. Unfortunately, Senator, I don't have those stats in front of me.
Okay. Also, in the list given to us by Clark County, there's 141 knives or 144 knives that were brought to school. What are there any deaths attributed to knives in Clark County?
John Jones on behalf of the Clark County District Attorney's Office. I do not have those stats either. I looked specifically at firearms in preparation for this hearing.
Okay. Well, I'd love to know all because, obviously we have 144. We have 26 guns, but we have 144 knives. I know knives are used frequently in homicides as well. I'm just kind of wondering if we're singling out one while ignoring another. But anyway, thank you, Madam Chair. If you can get me that information, I'd appreciate it.
John Jones on behalf of the Clark County District Attorney's Office. So I will look to see specifically any deaths related to knives. That's what you're looking for.
And the totals on juveniles, homicide, suicide, accident in Clark County, if I could.
John Jones on behalf of the Clark County District Attorney's Office. Any juvenile death related to firearms?
No, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay,
Yes,
thank
thank you.
Hello, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Vanessa Dunn, VANESSADUNN with Bells and Case Government Affairs, and I'm here on behalf of the Nevada Public Health Association. NPHA would like to offer their strong support, and there's also a letter written on Nellis for your review. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, I'm not seeing anybody else coming to the table to testify in Carson City or Las Vegas, so we'll go to the phone for testimony in support of SB 294.
If you would like to testify in support of SB 294, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Thank you, Chair. There are no callers wishing to testify in support at this time.
All right, then we will move to testimony in opposition of SB 294. Anybody wishing to give opposition testimony is invited to the table in Las Vegas or Carson City. I do see a couple people coming up in Las Vegas, so we'll start down there. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your service, and thank you for bringing this to the floor because We really do have a problem here, and I agree with some of this bill, but there are a few things that I think still need a little tweaking. And so I'd like to thank you, and also I'd like to thank John Jones. I appreciate the questions you posed, and I look forward to seeing the next edition. And I have a little bit of excuse with guns. I'm a gun owner. I own a large safe. And my daughter used to be a competitive shooter, but unfortunately she was murdered. But it wasn't by a gun, it was by fentanyl. I agree, we need to find a way to resolve this, but we've got to take a few more things out. First, providing the schools with armed guards and teachers trained to use the guns is needed in all schools. One of the things I really don't like that you put in there, I want you to reconsider. Punishing the parents who loses a child as a result of negligence would be incredibly cruel. The death of a child is a life sentence. I lost my daughter 2 years ago, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone. SB 294 infringes on our constitutional rights, however, and I think that enforcing current gun laws would be another place to start. And after using guns for a while, you know, I have the locks, I have the lock boxes, and I have a large safe. I have found that the lock itself on the gun itself is very, very troubling to use, and it would put my life in danger if I had to try and get that off in a hurry. So I really don't like that part of it. Everyone's circumstances are a little bit different too. I believe educating the parents is a very good idea, and providing them with some free classes instead of charging them to go to those classes would also be a good idea. And if they can't afford to buy some of these things that we need and I use, then find a source to get some lower costs and provide those to people who need them at a lower rate, or in some cases for free. But the way this bill is written, it appears to just be a little bit too punitive and intrusive in our lives. One size just doesn't fit all gun owners, and my government does not know what is best for my family, so I would like you to consider that and make a few revisions, and I look forward to coming back and hearing what you come up with. Thank you very much.
Hello, committee. My name is Leslie Quinn, for the record, and I ditto Ms. Profit. I oppose SB 294. The First Amendment states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. SB 294 violates the fundamental and inalienable rights. Every Nevadan citizen and every American has the right to keep and bear arms. Studies show that gun locks do not reduce accidental child deaths and suicides. However, gun locks do put abiding citizens at the risk of criminals. Criminals, nefarious peoples, or those with mental issues don't follow or care about laws or gun locks. They care about carrying out whatever act it is they want without regard to others. This is evidenced in the recent killing of 3 innocent 9-year-olds and 3 school staff in Tennessee. Legislation is best directed protecting the constitutional freedoms of law-abiding citizens. Please stop the endless barrage of legislation that focuses on destroying humanity, causing divisiveness, and mental health issues. We need to unite and support one another in what is good, ethical, and right as a constitutional republic. We are not a democracy. Please vote no on SB 294. Thank you.
All right, I don't see anybody else to give in-person testimony, so we'll go to the phones for testimony in opposition to SB 294.
If you would like to provide testimony in opposition to SB 294, please press star 9 to take your place in the queue.
DYRUSHOJJATY. While some of these ideas and plans are reasonable, they do not fully solve the problem. if we are going to have regulations on guns, we should also factor in other factors in what is causing these violent outbreaks. For one, coincidentally, these accelerated during the efforts of the lockdowns and all these other so-called pandemic measures. Two, we should look at controlling other factors. We have an issue with drugs, even big pharma. We have an issue with family. When we don't have good family structure, that increases the chance. When we have an issue where a disproportionate number of people who go to these schools are low income, so we need to raise wages. Not to mention, many of these conflicts are a result of racial and ethnic factors. So therefore, as it's been seen all over the world, all throughout history, differences of people will often lead to conflict. We should look into all these factors into consideration as well, not just completely pointing the finger at firearms. I yield my time, and ditto the other comments.
There are no other callers to provide opposition testimony at this time.
All right, we'll move to testimony in the neutral position on SB 294. Anybody wishing to give neutral testimony in person is invited to the table in Carson City or Las Vegas. And I don't see anybody coming up, so we will move to the phones for neutral testimony, please.
If you would like to testify in the neutral position for SB 294, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Thank you, Chair. There are no callers to offer neutral testimony at this time.
Thank you. I think our sponsor had to head over next door for a work session, but he's coming back in the door right now. Senator Doñate, we know you just had to go to a work session in another committee. We have concluded testimony if you'd like to make any closing remarks.
Walked in right on time. Fabian Doñate for the record. You know, in terms of closing remarks, I think this is an important conversation in general. You know, I was trying to reflect as to what my comments were to be today, and I recall, you know, a conversation that I had actually on a statement that I made on the floor of the state senate last session. And it was one of my first floor statements, and you know, I pretty much talked about my personal experience with this personal issue. You know, my generation has experienced the issue of gun violence unlike any other. We are the generation that has encountered this issue as part of our daily lives. As we got older and school shootings became more prevalent, we began to practice active shooter drills in our college years, learning to hide beneath our desks and finding the right ways to barricade a door from an intruder. We wore orange in middle school to show solidarity, not realizing that the trauma and consequences that would follow us after. I know that this is a tough conversation for many of us, and I hope that with the conceptual amendment we get a little bit closer where we can hold parents with a little bit more accountability, where we're educating the voters of this community as to what the laws are, what they entail, and then most of all, if there's a way that we can do to save one more life, I think that's a clear policy decision that we can easily make here today. SB 294 is a bill that we believe is aimed at solving one thing, and that's this. Students and teachers deserve an environment that is free and safe from violence, and we can do a better job to prevent the burden of gun violence. So let's start by passing this bill. So thank you so much for having me here today, and it's a pleasure to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the conclusion of our hearing. I'll now close the hearing on SB 294 and move to the last item on our agenda today, which is public comment. If anybody wishes to give public comment in person, now is the time to come up to the table, but I don't see anybody, so we'll go to the phones for public comment.
Thank you, Chair. If you would like to offer public comment today, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. There are no callers to offer public comment at this time.
All right, then that brings us to the conclusion of this meeting. We are meeting tomorrow in joint session with the Assembly. That meeting will begin at 2 p.m. and it will be upstairs. Okay, thank you. My committee already knows. It'll be in 4100 tomorrow at 2 p.m. And until then, we are adjourned.